After my best friend stole my husband, I immediately filed for divorce to clear the path for her. The lawyer was stunned, asking how my husband could not know I make hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. I just smiled. He thought he was leaving me homeless on a basic IT support salary, armed with a strict prenup he forced me to sign. He had no idea that same contract was about to make him lose absolutely everything. My name is Joanna, and I am 33 years old. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic partner. Growing up, I learned early on that independence was the only true safety net a woman could have. I built my career quietly, preferring to stay out of the spotlight while mastering my craft in the tech industry. I never cared about flashy designer clothes or driving a luxury car. I was perfectly happy working from home in my sweatpants, drinking regular coffee, and focusing on my code. My husband, Jason, was the exact opposite. He was 35 years old and worked as a regional sales manager, making $85,000 a year. In his mind, he was a high-rolling executive. He thrived on appearance, constantly upgrading his wardrobe and boasting about his negotiation skills to anyone who would listen. He loved being the provider, or at least he loved the illusion of being the provider. Then there was Amber. She was 33 years old, a flashy, image-obsessed real estate agent who had been my best friend since college. Amber always treated our friendship like a competition she desperately needed to win. If I bought a new handbag, she would buy a more expensive one the very next week. If I took a weekend trip, she would book a lavish resort vacation. I always brushed it off as just her personality. I never imagined her competitive nature would extend to my husband. The illusion of my marriage shattered on a typical Tuesday afternoon. I had been in Dallas for a major cybersecurity conference, but the final sessions ended early. I decided to drive back to our home in Austin, Texas, a day ahead of schedule, hoping to surprise Jason. I pulled into the driveway of our spacious suburban house. The afternoon sun was warm and everything looked perfectly normal from the outside. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, expecting to hear the television or Jason working in his home office. Instead, the house was deathly quiet. I set my travel bag down, and that is when I saw them. A pair of red designer stilettos was kicked off haphazardly in the entryway. I recognized them immediately because I was with Amber when she bought them 2 weeks ago. My heart did a strange, painful flip in my chest. A few steps further, I found Jason's expensive silk tie draped over the banister of the staircase. Panic and denial fought a brief war in my mind, but my professional training took over. In my line of work, you are taught to assess a threat, gather data, and remain completely detached from the emotional impact of a breach. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the camera application, and silently walked up the carpeted stairs. The master bedroom door was left slightly ajar. I stood in the hallway holding my breath and peered through the gap. There they were. My husband of 5 years and the woman who had given a tearful toast at my wedding, tangled together in the bed I had picked out. I did not kick the door open. I did not scream or throw things or demand an explanation. I knew exactly who they were in that moment, and no amount of yelling would change the reality of what I was seeing. With cold precision, I recorded a clear 15-second video capturing their faces and their betrayal perfectly. I hit stop, saved the file to a secure cloud server, and quietly backed away. I walked back downstairs to the kitchen. I slipped my diamond wedding band off my finger, feeling the sudden absence of its weight. I placed it squarely on the center of the kitchen island, where he could not miss it. I found a pen and a bright yellow sticky note. I wrote 4 simple words: "She can have you." I stuck the note right next to the ring, grabbed my travel bag, walked out the front door, and drove away. I headed toward downtown Austin, finding a quiet coffee shop to sit and process the massive shift my life had just taken. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window watching the city move around me. Less than 45 minutes later, my phone screen lit up. It started buzzing, continuously vibrating against the wooden table. Jason had woken up and found the ring. A normal person might expect a frantic phone call full of desperate apologies, tears, and begging for forgiveness. But Jason was not a normal person. His ego was too massive to admit fault. He chose to attack instead. His first text message appeared on my screen. "Do not be dramatic, Joanna. You have been neglecting this marriage for years. Amber is a real woman who actually appreciates my ambition and supports my drive." I stared at the words, feeling a strange mixture of absolute disgust and profound liberation. He was blaming me. He had brought my best friend into our bed, and he was framing himself as the victim of my neglect. I did not type a response. I just watched the screen as his arrogance fueled a relentless stream of messages. He texted again a few minutes later. "Do not think you can make this hard for me. Remember that prenup you signed. What is mine is mine. You better come get your cheap computer junk out of my house before I throw it all on the curb." That text almost made me laugh out loud in the middle of the coffee shop. 5 years ago, before we got married, Jason and his parents had cornered me. They convinced him that he was in line for a massive family inheritance. To protect his future assets from me, he hired a ruthless lawyer to draft a brutal prenuptial agreement. It included zero alimony, a strict separation of all assets, and an ironclad infidelity clause. I happily signed it without a single argument. What Jason did not know was that his supposed family fortune turned out to be nothing but massive consumer debt. And more importantly, he had no idea what that contract actually protected. Jason honestly believed I was just a basic help desk IT worker. He thought I spent my days resetting passwords and troubleshooting software glitches for $40,000 a year. He genuinely believed that his sales manager's salary was the sole financial pillar of our lives. My phone buzzed again with another message from him. "Good luck finding a place to live on your measly tech support salary. You are going to be homeless by the end of the month. Amber and I are moving forward, and you are out." He was so incredibly blind. He had absolutely no clue that I was a freelance cybersecurity architect contracted by several Fortune 500 companies. He did not know that my annual net income last year exceeded $850,000. And the greatest irony of all was his threat to throw me out of our house. Jason believed we were renting our luxury suburban home at a massive discount because of his stellar negotiation skills with a private landlord. He did not know that the private landlord was a limited liability company that I entirely owned. I owned the house he was currently sitting in with his mistress. I had been quietly subsidizing 75% of our rent, auto insurance, and utility bills for our entire marriage to let him feel like the big provider he so desperately wanted to be. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting his final text sit unanswered on my screen. He felt so powerful, so untouchable in his delusion. He thought he was tossing me out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. He thought he and Amber had won the ultimate prize. They had no idea that they had just activated the very trap they forced me to build. Jason had handed me the irrefutable proof of his infidelity, unlocking the breach of contract clause in his own prenup. I gathered my things and walked out of the coffee shop. I was not going to cry over a man who was already a ghost to me. I had a lawyer to meet and an empire to protect. The glass doors of Donovan and Associates slid open with a soft hum. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of polished marble and dark mahogany, designed specifically to make clients feel secure and opposing counsel feel inadequate. Mr. Donovan charged $800 an hour for his time. He was a veteran of Austin family law, a man who had navigated high-profile divorces for tech billionaires and real estate moguls with ruthless efficiency. I had researched him extensively before making the appointment. I needed a shark, and Arthur Donovan was the apex predator of the Texas legal system. The receptionist offered me sparkling water and asked me to wait. I sat on a pristine white leather sofa, my laptop bag resting beside my worn sneakers. I knew I did not look like the typical clientele that frequented this floor. I was still wearing the casual clothes I traveled in, having come straight from the coffee shop. A few minutes later, a heavy wooden door opened, and Mr. Donovan stepped out. He was a tall man in his late 50s with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit. He extended a firm hand, leading me into his corner office, which boasted a panoramic view of the Austin skyline. He gestured for me to take a seat opposite his massive oak desk. He opened a fresh legal pad and clicked his expensive pen. He looked at me with a mixture of professional sympathy and clinical detachment. He began by asking for a brief overview of my situation, expecting the usual tearful recount of a shattered marriage. Instead, I simply reached into my bag, pulled out a flash drive and a thick manila envelope, and placed them squarely on his desk. I told him I needed to file for divorce immediately based on infidelity. I explained that the flash drive contained clear time-stamped video evidence of my husband in our marital bed with my former best friend. I kept my voice perfectly level, delivering the facts with the same emotional detachment I used when reporting a corporate data breach to a client. Mr. Donovan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by my clinical approach. He took the flash drive and set it aside before reaching for the manila envelope. I informed him that the envelope contained our prenuptial agreement, along with my complete financial disclosures for the past 5 years. I watched as he pulled out the prenup. It was a thick document bound with a heavy legal cover. He put on his reading glasses and began to scan the pages. The silence in the room stretched out, broken only by the sound of him flipping the heavy paper. As he read, his professional composure began to crack. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. He looked up at me over the rims of his glasses. He told me this was one of the most aggressively one-sided prenuptial agreements he had ever seen in his 30 years of practice. He pointed out the specific clauses. 0 alimony regardless of the duration of the marriage. Absolute separation of all assets acquired before and during the marriage. No commingling of retirement accounts. A strict provision that any debts incurred by one party remained solely the responsibility of that party. And finally, a draconian infidelity clause stating that if either party committed adultery, they forfeited any right to petition the court for legal fees or transitional support. I nodded, confirming that I was intimately familiar with the terms. Mr. Donovan leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands. He asked me why on earth I had signed a document that essentially stripped me of every standard marital protection under Texas law. I smiled, leaning forward slightly. I told him the story of how that contract came to exist. 5 years ago, Jason and his parents had cornered me in their formal dining room. Jason's parents had recently sold a regional logistics company, and they had convinced Jason he was in line to inherit a massive family trust. They sat me down and treated me like a gold digger who was only marrying Jason for his impending fortune. They demanded I sign the prenup to prove my love was genuine. They brought in their own aggressive attorney to draft it, making sure it was ironclad. Jason had practically shoved a pen into my hand, boasting that he needed to protect his legacy. He told me that what was his would always be his, and what was mine would remain mine. I told Mr. Donovan that I had signed the document without a single complaint. I did not shed a tear or argue for better terms. I just smiled and signed my name on the dotted line. Mr. Donovan looked puzzled. He asked what happened to the massive family trust. I let out a short laugh. I explained that 2 years into our marriage, the truth came out. The logistics company his parents sold had been drowning in hidden liabilities. The impending fortune was entirely swallowed up by creditors and unpaid taxes. There was no trust fund. There was no legacy. There was only a mountain of debt that Jason's parents barely managed to escape through bankruptcy. Mr. Donovan chuckled softly, appreciating the irony of the situation. He tapped the prenup with his pen, noting that Jason had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect absolutely nothing. He said it was unfortunate for me that I was bound by such a restrictive contract, but we could easily use the video evidence to trigger the infidelity clause and secure a clean break. He assumed I was a low-income earner who would be walking away empty-handed, but at least free of Jason's financial baggage. That was when I told him to look at the second half of the documents in the envelope. I instructed him to review my tax returns, my W-2 forms, and the financial statements for my limited liability company. Mr. Donovan slid the prenup aside and pulled out the thick stack of financial disclosures. He flipped to the first page of my most recent tax return. He froze. He pulled his glasses off, rubbed his eyes, and put them back on. He leaned closer to the paper, tracing the numbers with his pen, as if he could not believe his own eyesight. He flipped to the next page, reviewing the corporate banking statements for my LLC. Then he looked at the asset list showing the deed to a massive suburban property held entirely under my corporate entity. He dropped his pen onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the polished wood. He looked at the documents and then looked at my worn sneakers and oversized sweater. He cleared his throat, his professional mask slipping completely. He read the final net income figure out loud. $850,000. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute shock. He asked me if this was a mistake. He asked if these numbers were accurate. I assured him the numbers were perfectly accurate. I explained that I was not a basic IT help desk worker. I was a freelance cybersecurity architect. I designed and implemented impenetrable security networks for global financial institutions and Fortune 500 companies. I conducted emergency penetration testing and handled massive data breaches. My clients paid me a premium for discretion, speed, and absolute technical superiority. I had been quietly building this empire from my home office for the entire duration of our marriage. Mr. Donovan picks up the prenup again, staring at it as if it were a magical artifact. He started laughing. It was a deep, genuine laugh of a man who had just witnessed a legal miracle. He looked at me with profound respect. He explained the magnitude of what Jason had done. By forcing me to sign that ruthless contract to protect his imaginary inheritance, Jason had legally walled himself off from my entire empire. Every single dollar I had earned, every corporate asset I had acquired, and the very house we lived in were completely shielded from him. The absolute separation of assets clause meant Jason had no legal claim to my business. The zero alimony clause meant I would not have to pay him a single dime of spousal support despite making 10 times his salary. And because Jason had breached the infidelity clause, he could not even ask the judge to force me to pay for his divorce attorney. Mr. Donovan set the papers down and leaned across the desk. He asked me the most important question of the day. He asked if Jason had any idea about my actual income. I pulled out my phone and opened the text thread. I handed the device to Mr. Donovan. I told him to read Jason's most recent messages. Mr. Donovan took the phone and read the texts silently. I watched his eyebrows shoot up as he read Jason's arrogant demands. He read the part where Jason bragged about Amber being a real woman. He read the part where Jason threatened to throw my cheap computer junk on the curb. He read the final message where Jason mocked my measly tech support salary and gloated that I would be homeless by the end of the month. Mr. Donovan handed the phone back to me, his expression a mix of awe and complete bewilderment. He stated that in all his years of practicing law, he had never seen a husband so aggressively confident while being so financially oblivious. He said Jason honestly believed he was the primary breadwinner. He asked how it was possible that a man could live with me for 5 years and not realize he was married to a millionaire. I explained that Jason only saw what he wanted to see. He wanted a quiet, submissive wife who fixed computers in the background while he played the role of the big, successful salesman. I told Mr. Donovan that I had intentionally kept my corporate accounts entirely separate, just as the prenup demanded. I explained how my LLC had been secretly subsidizing 75% of our rent and our household bills directly to the property management company. Jason thought he was paying the full amount because I engineered the payment portals to show him a heavily discounted balance. He thought he was a master negotiator living the high life on an $85,000 salary. Mr. Donovan shook his head, marveling at the sheer scale of Jason's delusion. He organized the papers on his desk, his legal mind clearly racing with the possibilities. He looked at me very seriously. He asked if we should notify opposing counsel of the massive financial disparity right away. He warned me that once the discovery phase began, Jason would eventually see these documents, and the shock might cause him to act erratically. I smiled, picking up my coffee cup. I told Mr. Donovan I did not want Jason to know anything yet. I wanted the divorce papers filed as standard routine documents. I wanted Jason to be served at his office feeling smug and victorious. I wanted Jason and Amber to spend the next few weeks celebrating their grand victory, believing they had successfully bullied a poor, helpless woman out of her own home. Mr. Donovan smiled back a dangerous predatory grin that confirmed I had hired the right lawyer. He understood exactly what I wanted. He drafted a simple engagement letter and pushed it across the desk. He promised to file the initial petition by the end of the business day. He told me to let Jason think he held all the cards because the higher Jason's ego climbed, the more devastating the final fall would be. I signed the engagement letter, stood up, and shook his hand. I walked out of the law office, leaving Jason's signed prenup securely in Mr. Donovan's possession. The trap was set, and Jason had built the cage entirely by himself. The very next morning, the digital assault began. Amber never was one for subtlety or discretion. She treated life like a reality television show where she was the undisputed star, and I was merely an extra who had finally overstayed her welcome. By 9 o'clock, my phone started lighting up with a barrage of notifications. I sat at the breakfast bar of my temporary hotel room, sipping a black coffee, and watched the alerts roll across my screen. Amber had gone completely public across every single social media platform. She did not just change her relationship status, she launched a full-scale public relations campaign to rewrite our shared history. Her first post was a carefully curated photograph of her and Jason sitting on the back patio of the suburban house my corporate entity owned. Jason was holding a ceramic mug, looking off into the distance with a manufactured look of profound peace, while Amber rested her head on his shoulder. The caption was an absolute masterclass in narcissistic delusion. She wrote a massive paragraph about twin flames reuniting about the universe, finally correcting past mistakes, and about how true love always finds a way despite the obstacles. The obstacle, of course, was me. She did not stop with a single announcement. A few hours later, she posted a mirror selfie from my master bathroom wearing one of Jason's oversized button-down shirts. She proudly displayed a row of my expensive imported face creams in the background, casually mentioning to her followers how nice it was to finally upgrade the house and clear out the old negative energy. She actually had the audacity to tag me directly in the post. She typed out a public thank you note right there in the caption. She thanked me for knowing when to step aside for true love. She told her audience that some women are meant to be stepping stones, while others are the final destination. My phone started ringing immediately. Mutual friends, former college classmates, and even distant relatives who had seen the posts were calling me in an absolute panic. They were outraged on my behalf. They flooded my inbox with screenshots of Amber's stories, demanding to know what was going on and asking if I was okay. They told me I needed to defend myself. They urged me to post my own statement to call Amber out for being a homewrecker and to expose Jason for the arrogant fraud he was. But I did absolutely nothing. I did not return the phone calls. I did not reply to the frantic text messages. I did not block Amber or Jason on any social platform. In my line of work as a cybersecurity expert, you learn very quickly that when a malicious actor breaches a system, your first move is never to alert them that you know they are inside. You sit back in absolute silence. You monitor their movements. You let them feel invisible and invincible because that is the exact moment they make their most devastating mistakes. My radio silence drove Amber crazy. I could see her escalating the frequency and volume of her posts, trying desperately to elicit a reaction. She posted videos of Jason cooking dinner in my kitchen. She posted stories complaining about the basic decor I had left behind, vowing to completely redecorate the entire house to suit their new elite power couple lifestyle. She wanted a public fight. She wanted me to scream and cry and play the role of the bitter, abandoned wife, so she could play the victorious new woman who had saved a man from a miserable marriage. By denying her that reaction, I starved her of the drama she craved. My silence also served a critical secondary purpose. It made Jason incredibly overconfident. He perceived my lack of response as total submission. In his mind, I was hiding under a rock, somewhere utterly destroyed by his rejection, and terrified of the impending divorce mediation. He truly believed he had broken my spirit and sent me crawling back into the shadows. While Jason and Amber were busy staging daily photo shoots in a suburban house they did not own, I was securing my new reality. I had no intention of staying in a hotel or moving into a modest apartment to nurse a broken heart. I wanted a physical space that reflected the massive financial empire I had secretly built. I contacted an exclusive real estate broker who specialized in high net worth clients and strict non disclosure agreements. I gave him my parameters, and within 24 hours, he secured exactly what I requested. My new home was a stunning penthouse apartment in a brand new ultra luxury high rise in the heart of downtown Austin. The building was a modern fortress of glass and steel offering unparalleled security and absolute privacy. You needed encrypted key fob access just to operate the elevators and a separate biometric scan to reach the penthouse floor. It was the kind of building where professional athletes, tech billionaires, and high-profile executives live specifically to avoid the public eye. I signed the lease using a newly formed holding company. My name appeared nowhere on the public records or the building directory. The property management team dealt exclusively with my attorneys and my financial managers. To the outside world, I was just an anonymous corporate entity leasing a premium asset. To Jason and Amber, I was a destitute IT worker practically living on the streets. The penthouse itself was a breathtaking masterpiece of modern architecture. It featured soaring 20-foot ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a magnificent, unobstructed view of the Colorado River and the sprawling Austin skyline. The floors were radiant, heated, polished concrete. The kitchen was an absolute dream, outfitted with custom Italian cabinetry and professional-grade appliances that belonged in a Michelin star restaurant. The master suite included a private wrap-around terrace, a walk-in closet the size of a standard apartment, and a bathroom wrapped entirely in seamless black marble. I did not bring a single piece of my old furniture from the suburban house. I wanted a completely fresh start, untouched by Jason's memory. I hired a premium interior design firm to furnish the space in record time. They brought in sleek minimalist pieces, custom leather sectionals, imported wool rugs, and modern art that perfectly complemented the industrial elegance of the architecture. Within 3 days, the empty glass box was transformed into a magnificent private sanctuary. My favorite room was the second bedroom, which I immediately converted into my new command center. I installed a massive L-shaped standing desk and mounted 4 curved high-definition monitors to the wall. I upgraded the network infrastructure, bringing in dedicated fiber optic lines to ensure absolute zero latency for my highly sensitive cybersecurity contracts. I sat in my ergonomic leather chair, looking out over the glittering city lights below, and felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. This was my true life. This was the reality I had earned through years of relentless hard work, late nights, and brilliant code. I had hidden it all away to make a small-minded man feel big. I had dimmed my own light, so Jason would not feel emasculated or overshadowed by his wife's success. Sitting in that penthouse, I promised myself I would never shrink my existence to accommodate someone else's fragile ego ever again. The contrast between my quiet reality and their loud illusion was almost poetic. Every evening, I would sit on my private terrace, sipping an expensive glass of imported wine, and watch the sunset paint the sky over the city. I would open my laptop and review my investment portfolios, watching my net worth continue to climb upward. Then I would open a dummy social media account and quietly check in on Jason and Amber to see what lies they were selling that day. Their digital performance was reaching a fever pitch. Amber was aggressively tagging luxury brands in her daily posts, trying to secure sponsorships by portraying herself as an elite Austin socialite. She posted a photo of Jason holding a bottle of cheap champagne with a caption boasting about how her man always treats her like an absolute queen. She staged elaborate videos pretending to look for new houses, declaring to her followers that the suburban house was just a temporary starter home until they found their true dream mansion in the hills. Jason was fully buying into the fantasy. He started posting lengthy business updates on his professional network accounts, puffing out his chest about his regional sales metrics. He adopted the vocabulary of a self-made millionaire, using buzzwords like synergy and disruptive growth, while talking about his mediocre $85,000 a year job. He commented on all of Amber's posts, validating her delusions and fueling the narrative that they were Austin's newest unstoppable power couple. They were so intoxicatingly arrogant. They genuinely thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had secured a bright future built on my defeat. They were spending money they did not have to impress people they did not even like, all while living in a house I secretly controlled and sleeping in a bed my money had purchased. I watched their daily updates with the clinical fascination of a scientist observing a flawed experiment play out exactly as predicted. They were accelerating toward the edge of a massive cliff and celebrating the speed. I knew the exact date when the financial ground would completely disappear beneath their feet. I just had to wait for the administrative processes to finalize. I just had to wait for the automatic payments to stop. Until then, I would enjoy my view from the top of the city, letting them bask in the absolute peak of their false victory. The higher their digital pedestal grew, the more spectacular their inevitable crash would be. Jason's grand performance as the ultimate provider went into overdrive the following week. He was determined to prove to Amber and to the world that he was a high-rolling executive, finally freed from the dead weight of a boring wife. His $85,000 salary as a regional sales manager was certainly respectable, but in a rapidly booming tech hub like Austin, Texas, it was hardly the kind of money that funded a life of limitless luxury. Yet Jason lived as though he were pulling in seven figures. He was able to maintain this spectacular delusion entirely because he had absolutely no concept of what his actual cost of living was. For 5 years, I had constructed a perfect financial safety net around him. I paid the utility bills through a blind trust. I covered the high-speed fiber internet, the premium streaming packages, the weekly landscaping service, and the comprehensive home insurance. I handled the property taxes and the homeowners association fees without ever mentioning a single number to him. Jason simply deposited his paycheck into his personal account and watched the balance stay comfortably high. He genuinely believed his financial comfort was the direct result of his own brilliant budgeting and supreme business acumen. The crown jewel of his delusion was the house itself. The sprawling 4-bedroom suburban property featured an outdoor kitchen, a custom-built pool, and a perfectly manicured lawn. In the current Austin real estate market, a property of that caliber easily rented for $4,500 a month. But Jason only paid $1,200. He loved to brag about this number to anyone who would listen. He threw a lavish weekend barbecue for his sales team to show off his new life with Amber. I watched the gathering unfold through the high-definition security cameras I had legally installed around the exterior of the property. I sat in my downtown penthouse, sipping a glass of iced tea, and listened to the audio feed as Jason leaned against the custom stone grill, holding a craft beer and holding court. His coworkers asked him how he managed to afford such an incredible house in a neighborhood where tech executives were constantly driving up the prices. Jason puffed out his chest and delivered a masterclass in arrogance. He told his friends that it all came down to being an alpha negotiator. He spun a ridiculous story about finding a desperate private investor from out of state who did not understand the local market. Jason claimed he had aggressively backed this naive landlord into a corner and locked down a multi-year lease at exactly $1,200 a month. He literally laughed out loud, calling the property owner an absolute sucker who lacked basic financial literacy. He told his friends that in the business world, there are wolves and there are sheep. He firmly believed he was the wolf. He never once bothered to look at the fine print of the master lease agreement. He never questioned why the portal he logged into only showed a fraction of the actual cost. If he had, he might have noticed the corporate routing numbers. Every single month for half a decade, my limited liability company quietly wired the remaining $3,300 into the property management account to cover the spread. I had subsidized his ego every single month, and now he was using my house to impress his mistress and mock his invisible landlord. Empowered by his low monthly overhead, Jason decided it was time to upgrade Amber's lifestyle to match his inflated self-image. Later that week, he took her to an exclusive European auto dealership in the upscale Domain District. Amber documented the entire excursion on her social media, broadcasting her triumphant shopping spree to all her followers. She posted videos of herself sitting in the plush leather driver's seat of a brand new luxury SUV, running her manicured hands over the steering wheel and giggling about how spoiled she was. Jason walked into the finance office and signed a brutal 3-year lease agreement for the vehicle. The monthly payments were astronomical, not to mention the premium insurance requirements for a car in that class. The finance manager likely raised an eyebrow at Jason's debt-to-income ratio, but Jason had excellent credit. He had excellent credit because I had spent the last 5 years making sure every single shared household expense was paid immediately and in full. He was leveraging the pristine financial history I had built for him to buy shiny toys for the woman who took my place. The SUV was just the beginning of the hemorrhage. They started dining out every single night at the most expensive restaurants in the city. They frequented high-end steakhouses and exclusive sushi bars where getting a reservation required knowing the right people. Jason would confidently drop his personal credit card on the table to cover $300 tabs without batting an eye. He tipped extravagantly to impress the waitstaff and make sure Amber saw him as a man of unlimited means. He bought her a diamond tennis bracelet for what he called their 1-month anniversary. He booked a non-refundable luxury vacation to a private resort in Tulum, Mexico for the upcoming winter. He updated his own wardrobe, buying tailored suits and expensive Italian leather shoes. He was bleeding cash at an astonishing rate, but he did not feel the pain yet. He was only paying the minimum balances on his credit cards, assuming his next quarterly commission check would easily cover the spread. Amber happily encouraged the reckless spending. She believed the fantasy just as much as he did. In her mind, Jason was exactly what he projected to be. He was the wealthy heir with the ironclad prenuptial agreement protecting a massive family trust fund. She thought his $85,000 salary was just his pocket money, a little extra cash he earned to keep himself busy while his investments grew. She had absolutely no idea that the massive family trust fund was a complete fabrication created by his parents to hide their own bankruptcy. She did not know that Jason's bank account was a shallow puddle drying up faster by the day. They were two chronic liars feeding perfectly off each other's massive delusions. Jason thought he was securing a high-status woman who finally recognized his brilliance. Amber thought she had successfully stolen a wealthy catch who would fund her elite socialite lifestyle indefinitely. Neither of them realized they were entirely dependent on the ghost of the woman they had betrayed. They were standing on a stage I had built, breathing air I had paid for, and spending money that was rapidly running out. I sat in my cybersecurity command center and monitored the situation with cold, calculated precision. I did not hack into Jason's personal bank accounts or violate any privacy laws. I simply watched the public records, the property management portals, and the social media feeds. I could see the exact trajectory of their impending ruin plotted out like a graph on my high-definition monitors. Jason's credit card balances were quickly approaching the $40,000 mark. The high interest rates were compounding daily. His monthly obligations had skyrocketed with the new SUV lease, the insurance premiums, the extravagant dining habits, and the minimum debt payments. He was operating at a massive monthly deficit, but the illusion of his cheap rent kept him ignorant of the danger. He thought he was a financial genius balancing a complex portfolio. In reality, he was a man walking blindfolded toward a sheer drop. The sheer entitlement of their behavior only validated my decision to walk away without a single tear. If Jason had shown even an ounce of remorse, or if Amber had displayed a shred of basic human decency, I might have felt a tiny twinge of guilt about the trap I was setting. But watching them revel in their stolen comfort eradicated any lingering sympathy. They believed my silence was a white flag of surrender. They believed my absence was proof of my ultimate defeat. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was completely hollow. They did not know that the master lease on the suburban house was up for its annual administrative review. They did not know that my corporate accountant was currently finalizing the paperwork to dissolve the automatic payment subsidies. They were living in a beautiful, fragile bubble of borrowed time and borrowed money. I finished my coffee and turned back to my monitors. The financial safety net I had maintained for 5 years was officially unhooked. I had given the property management company the green light to proceed with the standard commercial protocol for non-subsidized tenants. The administrative gears were already turning. The letters were already being printed. The automated systems were updating their ledgers. Jason had built his entire identity on the illusion of being a wealthy, powerful provider. It was time for him to pay the actual cost of his own arrogance. I sat in the ergonomic chair of my downtown command center, the soft blue light from my 4 curved monitors reflecting off the glass walls of the penthouse. It was exactly 10 o'clock on a Thursday night. The city below was alive with traffic and neon lights, but my focus was entirely on the encrypted banking portal displayed on my primary screen. This was the moment of extraction. In cybersecurity, when a system is compromised by a malicious threat, you do not negotiate with the virus. You isolate the infected nodes, you sever the connection to the mainframe, and you starve the threat of the resources it needs to survive. Jason was the compromised node. It was time to initiate the absolute quarantine. I navigated to the master dashboard of my primary holding company. 3 years ago, when Jason insisted we move to the suburbs to portray the image of a successful sales manager, I knew his $85,000 salary would never cover the mortgage on the kind of property he wanted. So I orchestrated a quiet corporate acquisition. I purchased the sprawling 4-bedroom house in cash through a blind trust nested under my limited liability company. I then hired a strict third-party property management firm to handle the daily operations, ensuring my name never appeared on any paperwork Jason would ever see. I engineered a master lease agreement that presented Jason with a monthly rent of $1,200. It was a number that allowed him to feel like a master negotiator and a financial genius, keeping his fragile ego perfectly intact. What Jason never knew was that the actual market rental rate for that property was $4,500 a month. Every single month on the 28th day, a silent, automated wire transfer executed from my corporate accounts to the property management firm, covering the remaining $3,300. I had been paying 75% of the roof over his head for years, just so he could walk around puffing his chest out. But the house was just the beginning. I clicked into the secondary ledger. My corporate accounts were also directly subsidizing his premium auto insurance policy, his high-speed fiber optic internet, his unlimited premium streaming services, and even the weekly landscaping crew that kept the lawn immaculate. I moved my mouse to the recurring transfers tab. My hand did not shake. My heart did not race. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, clinical satisfaction of a professional executing a flawless security protocol. I selected the automated wire transfer for the property management subsidy. I clicked Cancel Recurring Payment. The screen refreshed, displaying a green checkmark confirming the termination. Just like that, the invisible financial safety net vanished. The next invoice the property management software generated would not reflect the heavily discounted illusion. It would automatically bill Jason for the true, unvarnished market rate of $4,500. I did not stop there. I methodically moved down the list of every subsidized expense, systematically dismantling the fake life he was currently bragging about. I canceled the auto pay for the premium landscaping service, meaning the immaculate lawn Amber loved to post on social media was about to turn into an overgrown mess, unless Jason coughed up $500 a month out of his own pocket. I severed the corporate link to the utility accounts, shifting the massive Texas summer electricity bills entirely into his name. I logged into the auto insurance portal and removed the multi-vehicle corporate discount I had applied to his account, sending his monthly premium skyrocketing by 400%. I even logged into the cellular provider portal, separating his phone number from my unlimited corporate data plan and dumping him onto a basic individual tier with strict data caps. Then came the credit cards. Early in our marriage, Jason had convinced me to open a joint emergency credit card. He rarely used it, but it was tied directly to my pristine credit score and my massive available credit limits. In his mind, It was just a backup card with a $10,000 limit. In reality, it was a platinum corporate card with no preset spending limit. I knew that once his personal card started declining, he would inevitably try to fall back on that emergency plastic to keep up appearances with Amber. I navigated to the card controls. I did not just freeze the card, I permanently revoked his status as an authorized user and closed the account entirely. If he tried to swipe that card at a steakhouse or a luxury boutique, the terminal would return a hard decline and flag the account as permanently closed. With the outward flowing faucets completely shut off, I turned my attention to my remaining vulnerable assets. Working in tandem with Mr. Donovan's financial team, I began moving my massive liquid capital. I executed a series of encrypted wire transfers moving millions of dollars from my standard business accounts into a newly established, heavily fortified trust account that Mr. Donovan had set up specifically for the divorce proceedings. The trust was legally bulletproof, nested behind layers of corporate protections that even the most aggressive forensic accountant would spend years trying to unravel. By the time I was finished, my personal checking account, the only one Jason knew about, reflected a modest balance of $6,000. It perfectly matched the profile of a mid-level IT support worker. I leaned back in my chair, stretching my arms over my head. The silence in the penthouse was profound. I had just dismantled a man's entire financial reality in less than 20 minutes without ever leaving my desk. I thought about Jason and Amber sitting in my house, sleeping in my bed, completely oblivious to the fact that the gravity holding up their world had just been turned off. Jason had built his entire identity on the lie that he was the sole provider. He demanded respect and submissiveness based on the false premise that I depended on his $85,000 salary to survive. He traded me in for a flashy real estate agent because he thought his wallet was deep enough to fund an elite lifestyle. He was about to learn a brutal lesson in basic economics. The first of the month was exactly 4 days away. That was when the automated billing cycles would trigger. The property management company would hit his personal checking account for the full $4,500. The auto insurance would pull their newly adjusted premium. The utility companies would demand their massive summer deposits. His carefully balanced house of cards was going to face a Category 5 hurricane of actual living expenses. And because he had just leased a luxury SUV for Amber and maxed out his personal credit cards on fancy dinners and diamond bracelets, his cash flow was already stretched to the absolute breaking point. The most beautiful part of this entire operation was that I was doing absolutely nothing illegal or vindictive in the eyes of the law. I was simply following the exact terms of the prenuptial agreement Jason had viciously forced upon me 5 years ago. He had demanded a strict separation of assets. He had explicitly mandated that neither party was responsible for the maintenance or lifestyle of the other. By removing my subsidies and cutting off the corporate accounts, I was merely bringing our financial reality into perfect alignment with his beloved legal document. He had dug his own grave, poured the concrete around his own feet, and handed me the shovel. All I had to do was step back and let gravity do the rest. I imagined the sheer panic that would soon wash over him. Jason was a man who operated entirely on ego and public perception. When the money stopped flowing, he would not immediately confess his failure to Amber. He would try to hide it. He would try to juggle the debts, open new credit cards, and string along the illusion for as long as humanly possible. He would drain whatever meager savings he actually possessed just to keep Amber looking at him with that same worshipful expression she wore in all her social media posts. The stress would eat him alive from the inside out long before I ever faced him in a mediation room. I closed the banking portals one by one, watching the windows disappear from my monitors. I logged out of the secure servers and shut down the terminal. The extraction was complete. The compromised node was isolated. Jason was now entirely on his own, floating in a vast ocean of debt with absolutely no life raft. I poured the last sip of my coffee into the sink and walked out to the terrace, looking down at the glittering city lights. The warm Texas wind washed over me, carrying the faint sounds of the bustling city below. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter and more powerful than I had in years. The trap was fully armed. The countdown had officially begun, and all I had to do now was wait for the alarm bells to start ringing. The very first alarm bell rang just 48 hours later on a busy Friday evening. I knew exactly where Jason and Amber were because Amber had been broadcasting their entire night out to her followers in real time. They were dining at one of the most exclusive steakhouses in downtown Austin, a place where securing a table required booking weeks in advance or slipping the maitre d' crisp $100 bill. Jason, of course, opted for the latter. He wanted to impress Amber with his spontaneity and his supposed VIP status. I sat in my penthouse watching her social media stories unfold like a perfectly scripted tragicomedy. Amber posted a video panning across their table showcasing a towering seafood display billowing with dry ice smoke. Jason sat across from her raising a glass of expensive Cabernet, his smile radiating pure unfiltered arrogance. He was wearing a new tailored sport coat likely purchased on credit just for this occasion. He looked like a man who had conquered the world. He looked like a man who believed his wallet was an endless well of prosperity. In reality, he was a man ordering dry-aged Wagyu beef on a regional sales manager's salary while his bank account gasped for air. For years, Jason had cultivated this exact dining persona. He loved the performance of wealth. He loved engaging the sommelier in lengthy discussions about wine vintages. He loved ordering off menu items to show how sophisticated his palate was. And whenever the bill arrived, he loved casually dropping his primary debit card onto the leather tray without even glancing at the total. He could afford to do that in the past because his primary checking account was artificially bloated. Back when I was secretly subsidizing our entire existence, his only real monthly expenses were his gym membership, a few streaming subscriptions, and his golf club fees. His paychecks just piled up month after month, giving him the illusion of massive disposable income. He had grown so accustomed to that comfortable buffer that he completely forgot what real financial friction felt like. But tonight was different. Tonight, the buffer was completely gone. His account had already been hit by the massive down payment and first-month premium for Amber's luxury SUV lease. His recent shopping sprees and daily extravagant lunches had drained whatever cash reserves he had managed to accumulate. I could picture the scene perfectly as the evening wound down. The waiter approached their table carrying the sleek black leather folder containing the check. The total for their Seafood Tower vintage wine prime cuts of beef and artisan desserts likely hovered around $600. Jason probably did not even flinch. He likely continued his conversation with Amber, maintaining intense eye contact to show how unbothered he was by the cost of their lavish lifestyle. He simply reached into his wallet, pulled out his sleek metal debit card, and placed it on the tray with a confident smirk. The waiter took the folder and walked away toward the point-of-sale terminal. This was the exact moment Jason's carefully constructed reality collided with actual mathematics. When you swipe a debit card, the banking system does not care about your ego. It does not care about the designer suit you are wearing or the attractive woman sitting across from you. It only cares about the available ledger balance. And Jason's ledger was effectively empty. I can imagine the subtle shift in the restaurant atmosphere when the waiter returned to their table. At high-end establishments, they train the staff to handle declined cards with utmost discretion. The waiter would not announce the failure loudly. He would step in close, leaning down to Jason's level, keeping his voice low and professional. He would probably say something like, "I apologize, sir, but it seems your financial institution is not authorizing this transaction. Would you happen to have another method of payment?" Jason's initial reaction would be pure, indignant disbelief. A man whose entire identity is wrapped up in the illusion of wealth does not accept a declined card gracefully. He probably chuckled a tight forced sound designed to mask his immediate discomfort. He likely told the waiter to run the card again, claiming there must be an issue with the restaurant's machine or the network connection. He would insist his account had plenty of funds. The waiter, polite but unyielding, would have taken the card and tried again. And again, the terminal would spit out the exact same response: insufficient funds. When the waiter returned for the second time, shaking his head apologetically, Jason's facade would begin to crack. The cool, confident executive persona would shatter, replaced by the hot, prickly sensation of profound public humiliation. Across the table, Amber would notice the change in his demeanor. Her phone would drop to the table. She would ask what was wrong, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She expected a seamless luxury experience, and this unexpected friction did not align with the billionaire narrative she had constructed in her head. Jason is a skilled liar. He has spent his entire life bending the truth to suit his needs. So he did what any cornered narcissist would do. He immediately fabricated a cover story to protect his ego. He likely let out an exasperated sigh, rubbing the bridge of his nose to show his annoyance with corporate bureaucracy. He probably told Amber that his bank's automated fraud detection system had put a temporary hold on his account. He would blame it on his recent flurry of high-end purchases, claiming the algorithms must have flagged the luxury car lease and the expensive jewelry shopping as suspicious activity. It was the perfect excuse. It transformed a humiliating financial failure into a humble brag about his excessive spending power. Amber, blinded by her own greed and desperate to believe the fairy tale would swallow the lie whole. She would probably roll her eyes in solidarity, cursing the bank for ruining the end of their perfect romantic evening. But internally, Jason's chest would be tightening with absolute panic. To cover the massive bill, he would be forced to pull out his backup credit card. It was a high-interest rewards card he typically kept hidden away. A card that was already carrying a balance dangerously close to its limit, thanks to the recent vacation he booked to Mexico. He would hand it to the waiter, praying silently to whatever god was listening that the transaction would go through. When the waiter returned with the approved receipt and a pen, Jason would sign his name with a hand that was slightly trembling. He would leave an overly generous tip, trying to buy back the respect he felt he had lost in the waiter's eyes. He would smile at Amber, tell her everything was sorted out, and suggest they head home. But the damage was done. The seed of terror had been planted. He would inevitably excuse himself to the restroom before leaving the restaurant. That is where the real nightmare would begin. He would walk into a private marble stall, lock the door, and frantically pull out his smartphone. His fingers would shake as he opened his mobile banking application, waiting for the facial recognition to authenticate his identity. The dashboard would load, and Jason would stare at the screen in complete horror. His primary checking account, balanced the account he relied on to fund his daily swagger, was resting at a dismal $42.16. He would furiously tap on the transaction history, desperately trying to understand where his money had gone. The ledger would tell a brutal, unforgiving story. There would be the massive withdrawal for the down payment on Amber's car. There would be the daily hemorrhaging of funds at expensive lunch spots and boutique coffee shops. But the most terrifying detail, the detail that would make his blood run cold, would be the lack of incoming funds. His standard paycheck had dropped 2 days ago, but it had instantly vanished, swallowed whole by the aggressive auto drafts he had set up when he thought he had thousands of dollars in disposable income to play with. He would click over to his credit card accounts, and the panic would escalate into a full-blown physical reaction. The card he had just used to pay for the steakhouse dinner was sitting at 98% utilization. He had less than $300 of available credit left to his name. Standing in that luxurious bathroom stall, surrounded by imported tile and soft ambient lighting, Jason would finally realize he was in a total financial freefall. The month had barely begun. He still had weeks to go before his next commission check. He had to put gas in his car, he had to feed himself, and more importantly, he had to continue funding the lavish illusion he had promised Amber. And he had absolutely zero capital left to do it. He could not ask Amber to chip in. Her real estate commissions were notoriously inconsistent, and she spent every dime she earned on designer clothes to maintain her social media presence. If he admitted he was broke, she would look at him with disgust. The entire foundation of their relationship was built on his perceived wealth. Without the money, he was just an average guy who had blown up his marriage for a brief moment of validation. Jason would splash cold water on his face, staring at his pale reflection in the bathroom mirror. He would tell himself it was just a temporary cash flow problem. He would rationalize that he just needed to close a big deal at work, shift some balances around, and tighten his belt for a few weeks. He would actively suppress the rising tide of absolute terror threatening to consume him. He would put his confident mask back on, adjust his designer tie, and walk out of the restroom to join his mistress. He would spend the entire drive back to the suburban house gripping the steering wheel tight enough to turn his knuckles white, nodding along to Amber's endless chatter about their future plans. He would go to sleep that night in my bed staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with impossible math equations. He thought the decline card at the steakhouse was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him. He thought hitting the bottom of his checking account was the crisis. He had no idea that the real disaster was currently moving through the United States postal system, making its way directly to his mailbox. The declined dinner bill was just a tiny tremor. The actual earthquake was scheduled to arrive on Monday morning. Monday morning arrived with the suffocating heat typical of an Austin summer. Jason woke up in the master bedroom of the suburban house, still desperately clinging to the lie he had told himself all weekend. He had spent Saturday and Sunday aggressively managing his anxiety, convincing himself that the declined debit card at the steakhouse was just an isolated glitch. He watched Amber film her morning skincare routine for her followers, her phone propped up against the marble vanity my money had paid for. She looked so perfectly unaware of the financial cliff they were speeding toward. Jason kissed her cheek, tightened the knot on his silk tie, and walked downstairs to his home office to start his workday. He sat at the desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up his personal email. He expected to see the usual array of sales reports and marketing updates from his regional team. Instead, sitting right at the top of his inbox, was an automated message from the property management company. The subject line was flagged with high importance. The email was written in the dry, uncompromising language of corporate real estate. It stated that the master lease file had undergone an administrative review. Effective immediately, the corporate partner subsidy applied to the property had been permanently terminated by the sponsor. Consequently, the monthly rental rate would automatically revert to the true market value of $4,500, due on the first of the month. Jason stared at the screen. He read the paragraph 3 times, his brain completely refusing to process the words. He actually chuckled aloud, dismissing it as a ridiculous clerical error. He assumed the leasing office had mixed up his file with a commercial tenant. He picked up his phone and dialed the property management office, ready to deliver a stern lecture on administrative competence. He wanted to flex his muscles and remind them that he was the alpha negotiator who had locked them into a massive discount. A property manager answered the call, speaking with the bored detachment of someone who dealt with angry tenants all day. Jason launched into his tirade immediately. He demanded the error be corrected. He invoked his rights. He threatened to involve his legal team to sue them for breach of contract and to drag their reputation through the mud. He spoke with the aggressive confidence of a man who thought he held all the power. The property manager let him finish his rant without interrupting. Then he calmly instructed Jason to pull up his original digital lease agreement and scroll down to page 4, section 7. Jason put the phone on speaker and clicked through the documents on his laptop. He found the section. His eyes scanned the legal jargon he had completely ignored 5 years ago when he signed the paperwork. The clause stated clearly that the base rent of the property was indeed $4,500. It explicitly noted that the tenant was only responsible for a fraction of that amount, entirely contingent upon an active monthly subsidy from a third-party corporate sponsor. The clause further stated that if the sponsor ever revoked the subsidy for any reason, the tenant assumed immediate legal liability for the full market rate. Jason stopped breathing. He asked the property manager who the corporate sponsor was. The manager replied that they were a private limited liability company, and their identity was protected by strict confidentiality agreements. All the manager knew was that the subsidy had been permanently withdrawn, and Jason was now legally on the hook for the entire balance. The manager asked if Jason wanted to set up a payment plan for the upcoming month. Jason hung up the phone without answering. The silence in the home office was deafening. The walls of the house suddenly felt like a trap closing in around him. He opened his banking application again, staring at the meager remaining balance. The math was brutal and unforgiving. His $85,000 salary meant his actual take-home pay after taxes and basic deductions was roughly $5,000 a month. The rent alone was now $4,500. When he factored in the astronomical $800 payment for Amber's new luxury SUV lease, the sky-high insurance premiums, the utility bills, the streaming services, and the minimum payments on his maxed-out credit cards, his monthly obligations exceeded $8,000. He was operating at a catastrophic $3,000 deficit every single month, and he had absolutely zero savings left to bridge the gap. Amber walked into the office carrying a green smoothie, completely oblivious to the fact that her wealthy boyfriend was currently realizing he was mathematically bankrupt. She asked him what was wrong, noticing the pale, sweaty look on his face. Jason, the chronic narcissist, did what he always did. He lied. He forced a smile and told her it was just a minor administrative headache at work. He promised her everything was fine. He told her to go get dressed for lunch because he was taking her to a new fusion restaurant downtown. He would put the lunch on his final credit card, pushing the balance closer to the absolute limit. He was choosing to double down on the delusion, hoping a miracle commission check would drop from the sky to save him. But miracles do not happen for men like Jason. The first of the month arrived 3 days later. At exactly midnight, the automated clearinghouse system executed the scheduled draft from Jason's checking account. The property management software requested $4,500. Jason's account held barely enough to cover a fraction of that. The transaction bounced violently. The bank slapped him with a severe insufficient funds penalty, driving his balance into the negative. The auto insurance attempted to pull their premium 2 hours later, resulting in another rejected transaction and another massive penalty fee. The dominoes were falling exactly as I had modeled them in my head. Property management firms handling premium Austin real estate do not wait around for excuses. They operate with ruthless efficiency. 3 days after the payment bounced, a process server drove up to the beautiful suburban house. Amber was sitting in the living room filming a clothing haul video for her followers when she heard the heavy knock on the front door. She walked over and opened it, expecting a package delivery. Instead, the server handed her an envelope and used a piece of heavy-duty tape to stick a brightly colored piece of paper directly to the freshly painted front door. Amber stared at the paper in absolute shock. It was a formal 3-day pay or quit eviction notice. It stated that the tenants had exactly 72 hours to remit the full past due balance of $4,500 plus late fees, or the management company would initiate formal eviction proceedings through the county court. She was mortified. A bright pink eviction notice clashed horribly with her aesthetic, and she was terrified the neighbors had seen the process server tape it to the door. Amber ripped the notice off the wood, her perfectly manicured nails shaking with indignation. She marched into the home office and threw the bright paper onto Jason's desk, interrupting his sales calls. She demanded to know what was going on. She demanded to know why they were being threatened with eviction from a house he claimed they had locked down for practically nothing. Jason stared at the eviction notice, his heart hammering against his ribs. The physical proof of his failure was sitting right in front of him. He could not blame a bank error this time. He could not blame a temporary hold. The threat of homelessness was printed in bold black ink. But Jason's ego was a titanium shield. Even faced with absolute ruin, he refused to admit the truth to the woman he had blown up his marriage to impress. He stood up, grabbed the eviction notice, and crumpled it into a ball. He laughed aloud, a hollow, desperate sound. He told Amber it was an illegal shakedown. He lied and said the greedy, out-of-state landlord was trying to illegally break their ironclad lease so they could sell the property in the booming market. He told her not to worry her pretty head about it. He promised her he was going to call his lawyers and destroy the landlord in court. He swore he would handle it. He spun a narrative where he was the victim of corporate greed, and she swallowed it because the alternative, admitting she had stolen a broke fraud, was too humiliating for her own brand. Jason assured Amber they were completely safe. She gave him a relieved hug and walked out of the room to go post an inspirational quote about overcoming obstacles. As soon as she was out of sight, Jason collapsed back into his chair. He pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock the screen. He looked at the crumpled eviction notice, then looked at the calendar. Our divorce mediation was scheduled for later that week. His mind, warped by panic and entitlement, concocted a truly insane plan. He decided that the only way to save himself, the only way to get the quick cash he desperately needed to pay the rent and cover his mounting credit card debts, was to squeeze it out of me. He genuinely believed I was weak, desperate, and sitting in a cheap motel, waiting for him to tell me what to do. He had no idea he was preparing to walk into a slaughterhouse. The first message arrived on my secure device just before noon on Wednesday. I was sitting on my private terrace enjoying a catered lunch and reviewing a network architecture blueprint for a new client. The sun was shining brightly over the Colorado River, and my mind was miles away from the pathetic reality of my soon-to-be ex-husband. Then my screen illuminated with a notification. Jason had finally made his move. I did not open the message immediately. In cybersecurity training, you learn to observe a threat before engaging with it. I took a bite of my salad and watched the notification banner expand as a barrage of consecutive texts flooded in. Jason was typing frantically, his panic masquerading as aggressive authority. I let him send 6 full messages before I finally picked up the phone and opened the thread. His strategy was so predictable it was almost boring. He was employing the classic narcissistic tactic of going on the offensive to mask a position of absolute weakness. He started by attempting to establish dominance. He wrote that his legal team had been reviewing our marital assets and that things were looking incredibly grim for me. He told me that because I had been so negligent and uncooperative during the marriage, I was legally responsible for half of the household debt. He threw around terms like joint marital liability and equitable distribution, hoping to terrify me with legal jargon he clearly did not understand. Then came the demand. He stated that in the interest of keeping things amicable and avoiding a drawn-out court battle, he had prepared a generous settlement offer for our upcoming mediation. He would graciously allow me to keep my cheap computer equipment and my modest savings account. In exchange, I simply needed to assume responsibility for $40,000 of our joint credit card debt. He claimed this debt was accrued from basic household expenses and marital maintenance over the past few months. I actually had to set my phone down on the glass patio table and laugh. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man was breathtaking. He was holding $40,000 in high-interest credit card debt that he had entirely generated in the last 30 days by leasing a luxury vehicle for his mistress, purchasing her diamond jewelry, and buying expensive dinners to maintain his facade of wealth. And his grand master plan to save himself from the eviction notice taped to his front door was to extort the wife he had just betrayed into paying for his infidelity. My silence must have unnerved him, because 5 minutes later the texts escalated from manipulative negotiation to outright threats. He told me I needed to be smart about this. He reminded me that my tech support salary was barely enough to keep me off the streets. He warned me that if I forced him to take this to a judge, he would drag the divorce out for years. He threatened to bury me in legal fees that would bankrupt me. He promised that his high-powered attorneys would legally garnish my meager paychecks until I was entirely ruined. He ended the tirade by demanding an immediate response, telling me I had until the end of the business day to accept his extremely generous offer, or he would take the gloves off. I picked up my phone and took a screenshot of the entire exchange. I forwarded the images directly to Mr. Donovan with a short note asking for his thoughts on our opponent's latest strategy. Mr. Donovan called me less than 2 minutes later. I answered the phone and I could hear the seasoned attorney chuckling on the other end of the line. He told me that in 3 decades of practicing family law, he had dealt with every species of arrogant spouse, but Jason was truly a rare breed. Mr. Donovan explained that Jason had just handed us the final nail for his own coffin. by explicitly demanding that I pay for debts he accrued while actively engaging in an affair he was providing written evidence of his attempt to violate the prenuptial agreement he himself had commissioned. Mr. Donovan reminded me of the specific wording in the infidelity clause. It stated clearly that any debts incurred by a party engaged in adulterous behavior were the sole and absolute responsibility of the offending party, regardless of when the debts were established. Jason putting his extortion attempt in writing was a gift. It proved bad faith. It proved financial manipulation. Mr. Donovan advised me that we now had everything we needed to not only enforce the prenup, but to potentially request that the mediator award me administrative fees for dealing with a hostile and frivolous negotiation. I asked Mr. Donovan if everything was prepared for Friday morning. He confirmed that the financial disclosure packets were printed bound and ready for presentation. He also confirmed that he had officially received the notarized eviction paperwork from my property management company. We were fully armed. The trap was perfectly set with steel teeth. Mr. Donovan told me not to engage with Jason's rambling threats. He suggested I send a single non-committal response to let Jason believe his intimidation tactics had worked. I thanked Mr. Donovan and ended the call. I picked up my phone and looked at the angry block of texts Jason had sent. He was sitting in my house sweating over an eviction notice, desperate for a lifeline. He thought he was a terrifying wolf hunting a defenseless sheep. I tapped the reply box. I did not justify his accusations. I did not defend my salary. I did not argue about the origins of the credit card debt. I simply typed 4 words. Bring it to mediation. I hit send and immediately put my phone on silent mode, tossing it onto the outdoor sofa. On the other side of the city, Jason received my text message and completely misinterpreted the tone. Through the lens of his massive ego, my brief response was a clear sign of submission. He did not read it as a challenge. He read it as capitulation. In his mind, I was too frightened to argue back. I was too intimidated by his threats of endless litigation to put up a fight. He believed I had accepted my fate and was ready to quietly absorb his massive financial mistakes just to make the scary lawyers go away. I could easily envision the scene that followed in the suburban house. Jason probably let out a massive sigh of relief, his shoulders dropping as the immediate threat of homelessness seemed to vanish. He likely walked out of his home office, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face, and found Amber in the kitchen. He would wrap his arms around her waist and proudly announce that he had handled the situation. He would spin a completely fabricated story about how he had aggressively backed his ex-wife into a corner, forcing her to take on his bad debts, because his legal strategy was simply too brilliant for her to counter. Amber would look at him with total admiration, validating his delusions of grandeur. She would praise his dominant business acumen, completely ignorant of the fact that they were celebrating a victory that did not exist. Jason, feeling invincible again, would likely suggest they go out for drinks to celebrate his masterful negotiation skills. He would push his credit card balance a few dollars closer to the absolute maximum limit, blissfully unaware that the executioner was already sharpening the axe. The next 48 hours passed in a state of absolute tranquility for me. I slept deeply. I enjoyed my luxurious surroundings. I finalized 2 major cybersecurity contracts that would add another 6 figures to my quarterly revenue. I felt no anxiety about the upcoming legal confrontation. Anxiety is the product of uncertainty, and I possessed total absolute certainty. When Friday morning finally arrived, I woke up before the sun. I went through my morning routine with deliberate care. I stood in my massive walk-in closet and carefully considered my wardrobe for the day. This was a critical component of the strategy. I could not walk into the mediator's office wearing a bespoke Italian suit, carrying a $10,000 designer handbag. That would ruin the element of surprise. I needed to look exactly like the woman Jason thought he was divorcing. I needed to look like a mid-level IT support worker who was terrified of her powerful husband. I selected a pair of modest dark slacks that I had owned for years. I paired them with a simple, sensible button-down blouse and a generic beige cardigan. I wore flat, unassuming loafers. I applied minimal makeup, just enough to look professional but tired. I pulled my hair back into a plain, practical ponytail. I looked entirely unremarkable. I looked exactly like a woman making $40,000 a year who was overwhelmed by the legal system. I grabbed my standard canvas laptop bag, retrieved my keys, and headed down to the private parking garage. I bypassed the sleek black Porsche Panamera I had purchased the week before. Instead, I walked over to the modest 5-year-old sedan I had kept specifically for running mundane errands. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive to the mediation center took 20 minutes. The morning traffic was heavy, but I felt completely relaxed, listening to a classical music station and watching the city wake up around me. I pulled into the visitor parking lot of the prestigious legal building where the appointed mediator operated. I parked my unremarkable car between a towering luxury SUV and a sleek sports car. I walked into the building, taking the elevator up to the 14th floor. Mr. Donovan was already waiting for me in the reception area, holding a thick leather briefcase. He took one look at my outfit and offered a slight approving nod. We were entirely on the same page. We were going to let Jason walk into that room, believing he was the undisputed king of the world. We were going to let him build his pedestal as high as he possibly could. And then, with clinical precision, we were going to knock the entire foundation out from under him. The heavy glass doors of the reception area swung open and Jason walked in. He did not just walk, he swaggered. He moved with the exaggerated confidence of a man who believed he owned the entire building. Amber was clinging tightly to his left arm, acting less like a supportive partner and more like a trophy on display. Their appearance was almost comical in its desperation. They were completely dripping in debt-funded designer labels. Jason wore a brand-new charcoal gray suit that was tailored a fraction too tight, paired with a silk tie and a highly polished luxury watch. Amber carried a massive handbag covered in recognizable logos and wore an outfit that looked better suited for a nightclub than a legal office. They spotted me sitting in the waiting area next to Mr. Donovan. Jason looked me up and down, taking in my sensible loafers and my plain beige cardigan. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He leaned over and whispered something into Amber's ear. She let out a sharp, mean laugh and looked at me with absolute pity. They genuinely believed my modest appearance was a sign of total financial defeat. They thought my practical clothing was proof that I was already struggling to survive without his income. I simply offered them a polite blank stare and turned my attention back to my lawyer. The mediator, a stern-looking woman named Ms. Caldwell, stepped out of her office and invited us inside. She paused when she saw Amber. She informed Jason that mediation was typically reserved strictly for the two married parties and their respective legal counsel. She suggested Amber wait in the reception area. Jason immediately puffed out his chest, looking highly offended. He stated that Amber was his life partner, and he wanted her present for full transparency. Ms. Caldwell looked at Mr. Donovan and me for objections. Mr. Donovan deferred to me. I looked at Amber, who was glaring at the mediator. I smiled pleasantly and said I had absolutely no objection to her being in the room. I wanted her there. I wanted her to secure a front-row seat to the exact moment the ground vanished beneath her feet. We filed into the spacious conference room and took our seats around a massive polished glass table. Mr. Donovan and I sat on one side while Jason and Amber took the opposite side. Jason leaned far back in his ergonomic chair, crossing his ankle over his knee, trying to project ultimate relaxation. Ms. Caldwell sat at the head of the table, opening her notepad. She began her standard introductory speech, explaining that the goal of mediation was to find a fair and equitable division of assets without wasting the court's time. She barely finished her second sentence before Jason held up his hand, interrupting her. He leaned forward and unclasped his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick document and slid it aggressively across the smooth glass surface toward the mediator. He announced that there would be no need for a lengthy discussion about equitable distribution. He tapped his finger on the document and declared it to be an ironclad prenuptial agreement. He stated that the contract clearly dictated the terms of our separation, and he fully expected the mediator to enforce it to the letter. Ms. Caldwell picked up the document and adjusted her glasses. Jason did not wait for her to read it. He launched directly into his prepared monologue. He wanted to make sure everyone in the room understood exactly how important he was, and exactly how insignificant I was. He spoke to the mediator but kept his eyes locked firmly on me. He started by outlining his career, painting himself as a highly successful executive who had carried the entire financial burden of our marriage. He boasted about his sales metrics and his aggressive business strategies, acting as though he single-handedly ran the regional economy. Then he turned his attention to my career. He used a tone of voice usually reserved for speaking to a slow child. He informed Ms. Caldwell that I worked in basic IT support. He actually used his fingers to make air quotes when he said the word career. He explained that I spent my days working from home in sweatpants, resetting passwords and fixing router issues for mid-level companies. He called my professional life mediocre and unambitious. He said he had always supported my little computer hobbies, but that my salary was barely enough to cover groceries, let alone maintain the lifestyle he had generously provided for me over the last 5 years. Amber sat next to him, nodding in vigorous agreement. She looked at me with an expression of profound smugness, clearly thrilled to watch Jason degrade my worth in a professional setting. I did not interrupt him. I did not defend my career. I sat perfectly still, keeping my hands folded neatly in my lap. In cybersecurity, you let the hostile program run its full script in the sandbox environment, so you can analyze its complete intended payload. Jason was running his script flawlessly. Mr. Donovan sat beside me dutifully, taking notes on a legal pad, playing the role of the intimidated attorney, which only fueled Jason's inflated ego further. Jason then moved to the core of his extortion attempt. He leaned his elbows on the glass table, lowering his voice to sound serious and magnanimous. He stated that he was a reasonable man. He said he understood that I was likely terrified of being out on my own, without his financial protection. He announced that he was willing to make a very generous concession. He would allow me to keep my old car, my cheap computer equipment, and whatever meager savings I had managed to scrape together from my IT jobs. He stated he would not pursue a single dime of my personal assets. All I had to do in exchange was take responsibility for a minor portion of the marital debt. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table, detailing $40,000 in credit card balances. He claimed with a completely straight face that this debt was accumulated over the past few months, covering emergency household expenses and marital maintenance. I knew for a fact this was the exact debt he had racked up buying Amber designer clothes, luxury dinners, and a premium vehicle lease, but he presented it to the mediator as necessary survival debt. He told Ms. Caldwell that since he was generously waiving his right to audit my tiny savings accounts, it was only fair that I absorb this specific debt to balance the scales. He leaned back in his chair again, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He looked at me with absolute triumph. He reminded me of the specific wording of the prenuptial agreement he had forced me to sign. He quoted it word for word, staring directly into my eyes. "What is mine, and what is yours is yours." He told the mediator the contract explicitly forbade the commingling of assets and mandated a strict separation of liabilities. He pointed a finger at me and declared I had no legal right to his future earnings, his retirement accounts, or his superior assets. Jason smiled, showing his teeth. He said the prenup protected him from my financial incompetence. He demanded that I accept his offer to take the $40,000 debt and walk away with absolutely nothing else from the marriage. He threatened that if I tried to fight him on this, he would instruct his lawyers to drag the divorce out for years, drowning me in legal fees I could never afford on my basic salary. He finished his speech by stating that the ironclad contract was the final word, and he expected me to sign his proposed agreement today, without any further delays or negotiations. Ms. Caldwell finished reviewing Jason's settlement offer and set the paper down. She folded her hands and looked directly at Mr. Donovan. She asked if we had a response to the proposed division of debt. Mr. Donovan did not rush. He took his time opening his heavy leather briefcase. The metallic click of the brass locks echoed loudly in the silent room. He pulled out a single flash drive and a manila folder. He set the flash drive in the center of the table and opened the folder. He began by acknowledging the prenuptial agreement Jason had provided. He stated that we completely agreed with the premise that the contract was ironclad and should be enforced to the absolute letter of the law. Jason leaned back, his smirk widening. He probably thought Mr. Donovan was throwing in the towel. He probably thought I had instructed my lawyer to surrender without a fight just to get the process over with. Amber let out a soft, satisfied sigh. She leaned closer to Jason, resting her head on his shoulder, playing the role of the supportive, victorious partner. Then Mr. Donovan cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. He stated that while we agreed with the enforcement of the contract, we vehemently disagreed with Jason's interpretation of the liabilities. He pulled a single highlighted page from the manila folder and slid it across the glass table toward the mediator. He pointed specifically to Section 4, Paragraph B, the infidelity clause. He read the clause aloud, his voice steady and authoritative. The clause stated clearly that if either party engaged in an adulterous relationship during the course of the marriage, they immediately forfeited any and all rights to petition the court for shared liability regarding personal debts incurred during the period of infidelity. Furthermore, the offending party assumed total and absolute responsibility for any debts accrued under their name, regardless of marital status. Jason scoffed. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward, waving his hand dismissively. He told the mediator the clause was irrelevant. He claimed our marriage had been functionally over for months, and that his relationship with Amber only started after we had mutually agreed to separate. He spun a lie about how we had been living as roommates, and that his expenses were simply the cost of transitioning into a new single lifestyle. He looked at me with absolute contempt, telling the mediator I was just being a bitter ex-wife, trying to use a technicality to avoid paying my fair share of the household bills. Amber nodded vigorously, chiming in to support his narrative. She told Ms. Caldwell that Jason had been miserable for years, and that she had simply offered him a safe harbor. She claimed they had kept things entirely platonic until I had voluntarily moved out of the house. She said it was incredibly petty of me to try and ruin Jason's credit score over a few $1,000s just because he had finally found true happiness. Mr. Donovan did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply picked up the flash drive from the center of the table. He informed the mediator that we had irrefutable time-stamped digital evidence proving that Jason had engaged in a physical, adulterous relationship within the primary marital residence, while the marriage was still completely active and intact. He stated that the evidence proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Jason had breached the prenuptial agreement long before any separation was initiated. Jason's smirk vanished. The color began to drain from his face. He looked at the flash drive and then looked at me. His eyes narrowed, trying to figure out what kind of bluff I was pulling. He probably thought I had hired a private investigator to take blurry photos of him and Amber eating dinner at a restaurant. He probably thought I had hacked his phone to find flirty text messages. He had absolutely no idea that I had walked into our master bedroom and filmed them in the act. Mr. Donovan offered to play the video for the mediator right there in the conference room. He stated it was a brief 15-second clip, clearly showing both Jason and Amber in a compromising position on the afternoon of Tuesday the 14th. He noted that this date was 2 full days before Jason sent the text messages demanding I leave the house, and weeks before any formal separation was discussed. Ms. Caldwell held up a hand, shaking her head. She stated that playing explicit video evidence was not necessary for the purposes of mediation. She turned to Jason, her stern expression hardening. She asked him directly if he wished to contest the existence or the validity of the video evidence. She warned him that if he chose to challenge it, the evidence would be submitted into the public court record during the formal discovery phase of a litigated divorce. She reminded him that public court records were easily accessible by employers, background check agencies, and local media outlets. Jason swallowed hard. He looked at Amber, who was suddenly staring intently at her designer handbag, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him. If he fought the video, it would become public. His employer would see it. His sales team would see it. The entire professional network he had spent years trying to impress would watch him get caught cheating in his own bedroom. His carefully crafted image of the honorable, successful executive would be destroyed. He looked back at the mediator and shook his head. He muttered that contesting the video was unnecessary. He admitted through gritted teeth that the affair had begun before the separation. Mr. Donovan nodded sharply, recording the admission on his legal pad. He then pulled a second document from the manila folder. It was a detailed forensic accounting of Jason's $40,000 credit card debt. Mr. Donovan slid it across the table toward Jason. He explained that our team had reviewed the credit card statements Jason had provided in his initial financial disclosures. He pointed out that every single transaction making up the $40,000 balance occurred after the date the affair began. Mr. Donovan read a few of the transactions aloud, just to ensure the humiliation was absolute. He listed the $2,000 charge at the European auto dealership for Amber's SUV lease down payment. He listed the $4,000 charge at a luxury jeweler. He listed multiple charges exceeding $500 at high-end Austin steakhouses. He listed the non-refundable deposit for a private resort in Tulum, Mexico. He looked directly at Jason, his gaze cold and unrelenting. He stated that these were not marital maintenance expenses. These were the direct costs of funding an adulterous affair. He informed the mediator that based on the explicit language of the prenuptial agreement Jason had drafted, and based on Jason's own admission of infidelity, the $40,000 debt was exclusively his problem. He declared that my client Joanna owed absolute zero. Jason stared at the itemized list of his own financial recklessness. The trap had sprung exactly as designed. The ironclad contract he thought was his ultimate shield had just transformed into a straitjacket. He could not force me to pay for his mistress's lifestyle. He could not use the threat of litigation to extort me because his own contract prevented him from asking for legal fees. He was trapped in a room with a $40,000 anchor tied around his neck, and he had handed me the key to the padlock 5 years ago. He tried to salvage his pride. He sat up straighter, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. He told the mediator that $40,000 was a drop in the bucket for a man in his position. He claimed he would have the debt paid off with his next quarterly commission bonus. He glared at me across the glass table. He said I was pathetic for fighting so hard over a few credit card bills. He told the mediator he was perfectly fine taking the debt because it meant he never had to look at my face again. He declared that he was ready to sign the paperwork and walk away with his superior assets intact. Mr. Donovan smiled. It was the same dangerous predatory grin I had seen in his office during our first meeting. He had let Jason play his final card of arrogance. He had let Jason dig himself into the deepest possible hole. Now it was time to bury him. Mr. Donovan stated that resolving the debt was only the first part of the mediation. He noted that we still needed to review the full financial disclosures to ensure total compliance with the separation of assets clause. He reached back into his heavy leather briefcase, preparing to deliver the second devastating blow. Jason had no idea that the $40,000 debt was about to look like spare change compared to the reality of what he was actually walking away from. Mr. Donovan reached into his briefcase and produced a second manila envelope noticeably thicker than the first. He placed it carefully on the table, centering it precisely between himself and the mediator. Ms. Caldwell watched him with professional neutrality, but I could detect a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. Jason, meanwhile, had recovered some of his bravado. He leaned back again, crossing his arms over his chest, clearly believing the worst was over. He had lost the battle over the credit card debt, but he still thought he was the primary breadwinner, the wealthy executive gracefully allowing his destitute wife to walk away with her meager savings. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, Mr. Donovan began, his voice maintaining its steady, measured pace. We need to formalize the financial disclosures as required by the court, and more importantly, as mandated by the prenuptial agreement Mr. Vance drafted. He slid the thick envelope toward Ms. Caldwell. These are my client's complete financial records for the duration of the marriage, including tax returns, W-2s, and corporate banking statements. Jason let out a short, dismissive laugh. He looked at Amber, shaking his head. We really don't need to waste time on this, he told the mediator. I already said I'm not going after her little IT support salary. She probably barely cleared 40 grand last year. Let's just sign the papers and get this over with. Ms. Caldwell ignored his interruption. She opened the envelope and extracted the first document, the top sheet of my most recent tax return. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the lines of text. The silence in the room stretched out, punctuated only by the soft rustle of paper. I watched Ms. Caldwell's expression closely. The professional neutrality cracked, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. She pulled the paper closer, reading the numbers again, her lips parting slightly. She looked up from his document, her gaze shifting from the paper to me, then to Mr. Donovan, and finally landing on Jason. The look she gave him was a mixture of profound pity and absolute bewilderment. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice unusually tight, "are you aware of your wife's current employment status and income level?" Jason frowned, clearly annoyed that his narrative was being questioned. "I just told you," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "She works in basic tech support. She fixes computers for mid-level companies. It's a fine hobby, but it's hardly a career." Ms. Caldwell took a deep breath, setting the document down on the table. She slid it across the glass surface, positioning it directly in front of Jason. "I strongly suggest you review this document, Mr. Vance. It appears you have been operating under a significant misconception regarding your wife's financial standing." Jason sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes as he leaned forward to humor her. He picked up the paper, his expression broadcasting his belief that this was all a monumental waste of his valuable time. Amber leaned in closer, trying to read over his shoulder, her brow furrowed in confusion. I watched Jason's eyes track down the page. I watched them land on the line displaying my adjusted gross income. I watched the arrogant smirk vanish from his face, replaced by an expression of absolute uncomprehending horror. His hands began to shake. The paper trembled violently in his grip. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly ashen gray. He stared at the number, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish gasping for air. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "This is a typo. This says $850,000. Mr. Donovan leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "That is correct, Mr. Vance," he said, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "My client is a highly sought-after freelance cybersecurity architect. She contracts with Fortune 500 companies and global financial institutions. Her net income last year was indeed $850,000. The year prior, it was slightly over $700,000. The documentation is complete and verified." Jason dropped the paper as if it burned him. He stared at me, his eyes wide, his expression a chaotic mix of shock, betrayal, and dawning comprehension. The realization was hitting him with the force of a freight train. He hadn't been married to a low-income IT worker. He had been married to a millionaire. "You lied to me," he gasped, his voice trembling. "You hid this from me." "I never lied," I said calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I told you I worked in cybersecurity. You simply assumed that meant basic tech support. You never bothered to ask for details. You never showed any interest in my work. You were too busy performing the role of the wealthy provider to notice the reality right in front of you." Amber snatched the paper from the table, her eyes scanning the numbers. Her jaw dropped. She looked from the tax return to me, then to Jason, her expression rapidly shifting from confusion to outrage. The fairy tale she thought she had stolen was evaporating before her eyes. But the house," Jason stammered, his mind struggling to process the implications. "The rent. How did we afford—" "My client subsidized your lifestyle, Mr. Vance," Mr. Donovan interjected smoothly. "She utilized a blind trust to cover the majority of your household expenses, allowing you to believe your $85,000 salary was sufficient to maintain your standard of living." Jason slumped back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. The magnitude of his delusion was crushing him. The financial safety net he had taken for granted, the luxurious lifestyle he had boasted about, had all been funded by the woman he had just publicly humiliated and discarded. But the true devastation was yet to come. The final crushing blow was the realization of what his own actions had cost him. "And here is the most crucial point, Mr. Vance," Mr. Donovan continued, his voice sharp and precise. "Under the terms of the prenuptial agreement that you commissioned, and that you insisted my client sign, all assets acquired during the marriage remain the sole property of the individual who earned them. There is absolute separation of assets and absolutely zero provision for alimony." Jason stared at Mr. Donovan, the horror solidifying into absolute despair. You demanded an ironclad contract to protect your anticipated inheritance, Mr. Donovan said, driving the final nail into the coffin. That inheritance, as we now know, was non-existent. However, the contract you forced upon my client remains entirely valid. You legally walled yourself off from her entire fortune. You cannot touch her savings, her corporate assets, or her future earnings. You protected a multimillionaire from paying you a single cent. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a man realizing he had just burned down a winning lottery ticket. Jason had believed he was a master strategist, a ruthless predator securing his wealth. Instead, he had engineered his own financial ruin with breathtaking precision. He had demanded I sign a document that stripped me of all rights to his meager $85,000 salary. In doing so, he had legally forfeited any claim to the millions I had earned during our marriage. He had walked away from a life of incredible wealth, choosing instead to drown in credit card debt, to impress a mistress, all while hiding behind a contract that now guaranteed his destitution. Jason sat there broken and speechless, staring at the financial disclosures that documented his colossal failure. The arrogant, entitled executive was gone. In his place sat a man realizing he had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that follows a catastrophic impact. Jason sat paralyzed in his ergonomic chair, staring at the financial disclosures that had just annihilated his entire reality. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. He looked like a man who had confidently stepped out of an airplane only to realize he had forgotten to strap on his parachute. Amber sat frozen beside him, her hands gripping her counterfeit designer bag, her eyes darting frantically between Jason and my attorney. The fairy tale she thought she had stolen was burning to the ground right in front of her. Jason desperately tried to find a single piece of solid ground to stand on. His massive ego, the same ego that had driven him to betray our marriage and extort me, could not accept total defeat. He swallowed hard and adjusted his collar, attempting to project a hollow facade of resilience. He turned to Amber and forced a weak, trembling smile. He told her it did not matter. He said they did not need my money. He claimed he was still a highly successful regional sales manager, and they still had their incredible suburban house with the locked-in cheap rent. He promised her they would just go home, regroup, and build their own empire without me. That was the exact moment I decided to speak. I had sat in perfect silence for the entire mediation, allowing Mr. Donovan to dismantle Jason legally. But this final blow belonged entirely to me. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool glass of the conference table. I looked directly at Amber for the first time that morning. I spoke in a calm, level voice, completely devoid of anger or malice. I told her I had really enjoyed her recent social media updates. I mentioned how much I loved the mirror selfie she took in my master bathroom wearing Jason's shirt. I specifically referenced her caption about upgrading the house and clearing out the old negative energy. Amber's face flushed a deep crimson. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, suddenly acutely aware of how ridiculous she looked sitting in a legal office dripping in debt-funded luxury items. Jason frowned, entirely confused as to why I was bringing up internet posts during a divorce mediation. He told me to stop being petty and to just let them leave. He stated they were going to drive back to their house and put this entire nightmare behind them. I shook my head slowly. I told Jason he was not going back to his house. I told him he was currently sitting across from the private, out-of-state investor he had been mocking to his sales team for the past 5 years. Jason stopped breathing. His brow furrowed as his brain completely stalled out, unable to process the words I had just spoken. I reached into my plain canvas laptop bag and pulled out a single slim blue folder. I slid it across the glass table, coming to rest directly on top of the prenup he had weaponized against himself. I invited him to open it. I told him to look very closely at the articles of incorporation for the property management holding company. I told him to look at the name of the sole registered proprietor. Jason reached out with a trembling hand and flipped the folder open. His eyes scanned the official state-stamped documents. He read the name of the LLC. He read my name printed clearly underneath it as the absolute sole owner. He looked at the original deed to the property proving the house had been purchased in cash 3 years ago. I watched the final lingering shreds of his arrogance evaporate into the air. I explained the mechanics of his reality to him using small, simple words. I reminded him of the time he had bragged to his friends about backing a naive landlord into a corner to secure a multi-year lease at $1,200 a month. I told him there was no naive landlord. There was only a wife who made $850,000 a year secretly subsidizing 75% of his rent through a blind corporate trust just so he could feel like a powerful provider. I told him I was the one paying for the premium landscaping that kept the grass green for Amber's photo shoots. I was the one paying for the high-speed fiber optic internet he used to send his threatening text messages. I was the one covering the massive property taxes while he confidently blew his mediocre salary on expensive steakhouses and luxury car leases. I told him his entire identity as a successful executive was a charity project I had funded out of pity. Amber let out a sharp gasp. She pulled her hands away from Jason as if he had suddenly caught a highly contagious disease. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The man she thought was a wealthy, high-rolling catch was actually a subsidized dependent living on an allowance provided by the woman he had cheated on. Jason's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He tried to speak, trying to formulate some kind of defense or explanation, but his mind was shattered. He finally managed to stammer out a question about the eviction notice. He asked if I was the one who had sent the process server to the house on Monday morning. I smiled pleasantly and confirmed that I was indeed the source of the bright pink paper taped to his front door. I reminded him of the strict terms of his beloved prenuptial agreement. I pointed out that since we were maintaining an absolute separation of assets, it was no longer appropriate for my corporate entity to subsidize his living expenses. I explained that when I canceled the automated wire transfers, the property management software simply functioned exactly as it was programmed to do. It billed him for the actual true market rate of $4,500. And because he was completely broke and drowning in $40,000 of fresh credit card debt, his payment had violently bounced. Jason looked at the mediator, his eyes wide with sheer panic. He pleaded with Ms. Caldwell, claiming this was an illegal retaliatory eviction. He begged her to intervene, stating that a landlord could not just kick a tenant out without proper warning or a chance to pay the balance. Mr. Donovan cleared his throat smoothly, taking control of the legal parameters. He informed Jason that there was nothing illegal or retaliatory about a standard commercial eviction for non-payment of rent. He reminded Jason that the 3-day pay or quit notice had been legally served on Monday morning. He noted that instead of paying the outstanding balance, Jason had crumpled the notice up and chosen to spend his time aggressively texting my client demanding she absorb his credit card debt. Mr. Donovan reached into his heavy leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the county court. He stated that because the mandatory 72-hour grace period had officially expired at midnight without a single cent of payment received, the property management company had immediately filed the final paperwork with the judge. Mr. Donovan slid the white envelope across the glass table. It bumped gently against Jason's hands. Mr. Donovan announced that Jason and Amber were now officially and legally served with a final writ of possession. I leaned forward, looking directly into Jason's terrified eyes. I delivered the final crushing blow with absolute precision. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to vacate my property. I told him that if he and Amber were not completely moved out by Sunday morning, the county sheriff would arrive to physically remove them from the premises and drag their belongings to the curb. I reminded him to make sure he packed up all his cheap computer junk before the authorities arrived. Amber stood up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the carpeted floor. She did not bother to pick it up. She looked at Jason, her face contorted with absolute rage. She screamed that he was a broke, pathetic fraud. She yelled that he had ruined her life and tricked her into signing a luxury vehicle lease she could never afford on her own. She completely abandoned the supportive twin flames narrative she had been broadcasting all week. Confronted with the reality of impending homelessness and massive financial ruin, her true colors bled through instantly. She grabbed her counterfeit designer bag, turned on her heel, and stormed out of the conference room, leaving the heavy glass door slamming shut behind her. Jason sat alone on his side of the massive table. The woman he had destroyed his marriage for had just abandoned him at the first sign of financial distress. The wealth he thought he possessed was a complete illusion. The ironclad contract he had weaponized to protect his ego had legally blocked him from millions of dollars. He was $40,000 in debt. His wages were about to be aggressively garnished. He had no savings, no safety net, and absolutely nowhere to live. He was entirely ruined. He looked across the table at me, tears finally welling up in his eyes. He opened his mouth to beg. He started to apologize, stammering about how he had made a terrible mistake, how Amber had manipulated him, how we could still fix this if I just gave him another chance. I did not let him finish. I stood up from my ergonomic chair, smoothing the wrinkles from my plain beige cardigan. I picked up my practical canvas laptop bag and slung it over my shoulder. I looked down at the man who had thought he could discard me and leave me destitute on the streets. I told him I wished him the absolute best of luck finding a new apartment by Sunday. I reminded him that Austin was a very expensive city for a man living on a regional sales manager salary. I turned and walked out of the conference room with Mr. Donovan right beside me. I did not look back. I walked down the quiet carpeted hallway toward the elevators, my sensible loafers making no sound at all. I stepped into the elevator cabin and watched the polished steel doors slide shut, closing the final chapter on the most spectacular mistake Jason Vance would ever make in his entire life. The elevator doors slid open on the ground floor of the legal building. Mr. Donovan offered a respectful nod and a firm handshake before turning toward his private parking garage. I stepped out through the heavy glass doors and into the blistering heat of the Texas afternoon. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the polished concrete and the rows of expensive vehicles in the visitor lot. I reached into my canvas bag for my sunglasses, feeling a profound sense of lightness. The crushing weight of Jason's projected insecurities was completely gone. I was finally free. Before I even reached the middle of the parking lot, the sound of shrill, hysterical screaming cut through the humid air. I paused, adjusting my sunglasses, and looked across the asphalt. The source of the commotion was impossible to miss. Amber and Jason were standing next to the luxury SUV Jason had leased just 2 weeks ago. Amber was pacing back and forth, her arms flailing wildly, her counterfeit designer bag swinging aggressively from her elbow. Jason was standing against the driver's side door, holding his hands up in a defensive, placating gesture. I did not have to strain to hear what she was saying. Amber was screaming at the top of her lungs, completely abandoning the polished elite socialite persona she had spent years cultivating. She shrieked that Jason was a pathetic, broke fraud. Her voice echoed off the surrounding concrete structures, drawing the attention of everyone within a 100-yard radius. She yelled about the $40,000 in credit card debt. She screamed about the eviction notice. She demanded to know how he expected to pay for the luxury car she was currently standing next to, realizing with sudden violent clarity that the monthly payments were going to bounce and the vehicle would inevitably be repossessed. Jason tried to shush her, glancing nervously around the parking lot. He pleaded with her to lower her voice, stammering that they could figure it out, that he just needed to close a few accounts, that it was a temporary cash flow issue. His attempts to maintain control only infuriated Amber further. She lunged forward and shoved him hard against the side of the SUV. She told him he was a disgusting, manipulative liar. She screamed that she had ruined her reputation for a man who could not even afford to buy her a fast food dinner without putting it on a maxed-out credit card. The spectacle was too dramatic to ignore. Several people walking to their cars had stopped completely. I noticed a group of young law clerks standing near the building entrance. 2 of them had their smartphones out, the camera lenses pointed directly at the screaming match. In a tech hub like Austin, a public meltdown in a prestigious corporate parking lot is digital gold. Amber was so blinded by her fury that she did not notice the cameras recording her entire unhinged tirade. She reached into her purse, pulled out the keys to the leased SUV, and hurled them directly at Jason's chest. They bounced off his expensive tailored suit and clattered onto the hot asphalt. She yelled that she was calling a rideshare and that she never wanted to see his pathetic broke face again. She turned on her heel and stomped away toward the street, leaving Jason standing completely alone. I watched the entire scene with clinical detachment. I did not feel pity. I did not feel triumph. I simply observed the natural consequences of their combined arrogance. I turned away and continued walking toward my vehicle. I clicked the unlock button on my key fob. The lights on my sleek black Porsche Panamera flashed twice, the engine letting out a low, powerful growl as the systems activated. The sound caught Jason's attention. He looked up from the pavement where the SUV keys lay. He saw me standing next to the high-performance sports car. He looked at my plain beige cardigan, my sensible loafers, and then looked at the $100,000 vehicle I was casually opening. The final puzzle piece of his absolute humiliation snapped into place. He realized that the wealth he had desperately tried to project was the wealth I actually possessed. Desperation completely vaporized whatever shred of dignity Jason had left. He abandoned the leased SUV and started running across the parking lot toward me. His tailored suit jacket flapped open, his face flushed and sweating profusely in the summer heat. He called my name, his voice cracking with panic. He reached the passenger side of the Porsche just as I was sliding into the driver's seat. He placed his hands flat against the tinted glass, leaning down to look at me. He started begging. The arrogant, untouchable executive who had demanded I take his debt less than an hour ago was now pleading for his financial life. He babbled that Amber was crazy, that she was a gold digger who had manipulated him into the affair. He claimed he had been under immense pressure at work and had made a terrible, foolish mistake. He swore he still loved me. He begged me to just talk to him, to give him one more chance to fix our marriage. He said we could cancel the divorce, go to counseling, and go back to our beautiful house. The house, he finally understood, belonged entirely to me. I settled into the plush leather seat and closed the door. I pressed the button to lower the passenger window just a few inches. I looked at his sweaty, panicked face. I did not yell. I did not call him names. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a professional terminating a canceled contract. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to vacate my property. I advised him to start packing his cheap suits immediately. Before he could utter another desperate excuse, I pressed the button to roll the window back up. The thick, soundproof glass slid into place, completely silencing his frantic pleading. I put the Porsche into drive, the powerful engine purring smoothly. I pulled out of the parking space, leaving Jason standing in the blistering heat, surrounded by witnesses, completely broken and entirely alone. I pulled onto the main road and headed toward my downtown penthouse, leaving my past in the rearview mirror. As I navigated the Austin traffic toward my luxury high-rise, I felt a profound sense of closure. The man standing in the parking lot was a complete stranger to me now. The illusion he had maintained for 5 years was finally shattered, and the reality was entirely pathetic. I parked my Porsche in my secured designated spot and took the private elevator up to my sanctuary. The fallout was swifter and more brutal than I could have ever orchestrated. By 7 o'clock that evening, I was sitting on my private terrace with a glass of imported wine, scrolling through a dummy social media account. The video recorded by the law clerks had already hit the internet. It spread through the local Austin networks like wildfire. Someone had posted it to a popular city gossip page with a caption mocking the fake millionaire and his screaming mistress. The footage was crystal clear. Amber's face was perfectly recognizable as she shrieked about Jason's massive credit card debt and impending eviction. In the highly competitive, image-obsessed Austin real estate market, reputation is everything. Amber had spent years cultivating an elite, polished persona to attract wealthy clients. In less than 2 minutes of viral video, she had exposed herself as an unstable, shallow opportunist who was romantically involved with a broke fraud. Her professional credibility was incinerated instantly. Amber's brokerage firm would undoubtedly see the footage by Monday morning. Real estate is built entirely on trust and public image. You cannot sell premium suburban homes when there is viral video evidence of you getting evicted from one for non-payment of rent while screaming at your fraudulent boyfriend in a parking lot. Her broker would quietly ask her to clear out her desk to avoid associating their brand with her toxic viral meltdown. Clients would never trust her with multi-million-dollar listings after watching her scream obscenities over a bounced car lease. The digital humiliation was equally devastating for Jason. His regional sales team, the same people he had hosted at my house for his arrogant barbecue, undoubtedly saw the video. The comments section under the viral post was absolutely ruthless. Locals dissected Amber's designer outfit, pointing out that true wealth whispers while fake wealth screams. They mocked Jason's ill-fitting suit and his pathetic posture as he took the verbal beating. The video was shared across corporate messaging channels, real estate networking groups, and neighborhood forums. It was the ultimate digital branding, a permanent stain on both of their names. Jason had tried to use the threat of public humiliation to keep me in line, warning me that my reputation would suffer if I fought the divorce. Instead, the universe had delivered his exact threat right back onto his own head. I closed the social media application and set my phone face down on the glass table. I took a slow sip of my wine, enjoying the cool evening breeze off the river. I did not have to raise my voice or lift a single finger in anger. They had completely destroyed themselves. The absolute precision of cybersecurity applied perfectly to real life. The eviction clock was ticking down. The 48 hours were almost up, and I possessed total absolute peace. 6 months passed with the quiet, relentless efficiency of a perfectly optimized algorithm. I transitioned my operations from the penthouse command center into a massive commercial space in downtown Austin. The new headquarters of my cybersecurity firm occupied the entire top floor of a premier glass and steel tower. My name was no longer hidden behind blind trusts or quiet limited liability companies. I stepped completely into the light. I doubled my staff, secured 3 new government contracts, and pushed my annual net revenue well past the 7-figure mark. The woman who used to sit in sweatpants, shrinking her existence to accommodate a fragile male ego, was officially dead and buried. In her place sat the undisputed architect of a digital empire. The divorce was finalized with breathtaking speed. Without my income to subsidize his legal battle, Jason could not afford a lawyer to drag out the proceedings. The judge took one look at the ironclad prenuptial agreement Jason had drafted, noted the clear breach of the infidelity clause, and signed the final decree. Jason walked away with exactly what he demanded 5 years ago. What was his remained his. Unfortunately for him, what was his consisted entirely of high-interest unsecured debt. The eviction from my suburban property had been absolute poetry. Jason and Amber failed to secure emergency funding before the 48-hour deadline. On Sunday morning, the county sheriff arrived just as I promised. Neighbors watched from their driveways as the authorities forced Jason and Amber to carry their cheap computer junk and designer knockoffs to the curb. The credit card companies did not care about his excuses. When he defaulted on the massive balance he accrued spoiling his mistress, the banks moved swiftly. They secured court judgments and aggressively garnished his wages. His $85,000 salary, once a source of immense pride, was slashed down to the bare legal minimum required for survival. Unable to afford even a basic studio apartment in the inflated Austin market, Jason was forced to pack his meager belongings into garbage bags and move back into his parents' basement. The irony was exquisite. The same parents who had convinced him to force a ruthless prenup to protect a non-existent family fortune were now supporting their bankrupt divorced son on their fixed retirement income. Jason spent his days making cold calls for a regional sales team that no longer respected him, returning every night to a damp, windowless basement, entirely stripped of his swagger and his illusions. Amber's descent was equally spectacular. The viral parking lot video was the ultimate career execution. In the high-stakes world of Austin real estate, public perception dictates your net worth. No multimillionaire tech executive or luxury developer was going to entrust their property portfolio to a woman famous for screaming obscenities over a bounced car lease. Her prestigious brokerage firm severed her contract less than 48 hours after the video hit the local gossip pages. They quietly deleted her profile from their website and mailed her personal belongings to the suburban house she was actively being evicted from. Amber attempted to do damage control online. She posted tearful videos claiming the parking lot meltdown was taken out of context or that she was the victim of a targeted harassment campaign. The internet, however, is completely unforgiving. The comments sections under her videos were flooded with laughing emojis and screenshots of her eviction notice. Without her primary income or Jason's stolen subsidies, the financial reality crushed her. The luxury European SUV she had proudly paraded on social media was unceremoniously repossessed from a grocery store parking lot, leaving her stranded with a cart full of items she could no longer afford to buy. Desperate to maintain the facade of a successful businesswoman, Amber attempted to go independent. She scraped together whatever remaining credit she had and rented a small rundown office space in a struggling boutique commercial building on the edge of downtown. She spent her days posting heavily filtered inspirational quotes to a dwindling social media audience, pretending she was an elite broker while practically begging for entry-level residential listings that never materialized. I sat at the head of my custom mahogany conference table, the morning sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new firm. A junior associate from my wealth management division walked into the room carrying a thick leather-bound portfolio. As my primary cybersecurity firm expanded, my financial advisors recommended diversifying my massive liquid capital into commercial real estate. I had authorized them to scout undervalued commercial properties in the Austin metropolitan area. The associate placed the portfolio in front of me, tapping the cover with a manicured finger. He explained that they had identified a prime acquisition target. It was an aging multi-tenant boutique commercial building that had recently fallen into financial distress. The current owner was desperate to liquidate the asset, quickly offering it at a significant discount. The associate noted that with a strategic renovation and aggressive rent restructuring, the property would generate a massive return on investment within 2 years. I opened the portfolio and reviewed the standard disclosures, the architectural blueprints, and the current tenant manifest. I scanned the list of businesses currently occupying the ground floor suites. My eyes stopped on Suite 104. The registered tenant was Amber Elite Realty. I stared at the name, a slow, deep smile spreading across my face. The universe truly has an incredible sense of humor. Amber was currently sitting in a dilapidated office, desperately clinging to the final shreds of her fake real estate empire, completely unaware that the building she occupied was being offered to the very woman she had tried to replace. I picked up my favorite gold-plated fountain pen. I did not hesitate. I did not ask for further market analysis or secondary appraisals. I flipped to the final page of the acquisition agreement and signed my name with a series of sharp, decisive strokes. I handed the portfolio back to the junior associate and instructed him to execute the wire transfer immediately. I told him to close the deal by the end of the business day. I also gave him one additional highly specific directive. I instructed him to draft a formal legal notice to all current tenants regarding the change in ownership. I told him to mandate an immediate comprehensive audit of all existing commercial leases. I specifically requested that the tenant in Suite 104 receive her notice via certified mail requiring a direct signature. I wanted to ensure she held the physical proof of her new reality in her own hands. I planned to strictly enforce every single building code regulation and parking restriction outlined in the commercial lease agreement. If Amber's business vehicle occupied a reserved spot for even 1 minute past the permitted time frame, my newly contracted towing company would remove it instantly. If her rent payment was delayed by a single hour, the late fees would be applied with ruthless automated precision. As the associate walked out of the conference room to finalize the purchase, I stood up and walked over to the expansive glass wall. I looked out over the sprawling Austin skyline, watching the traffic flow over the bridges and the sunlight glint off the skyscrapers. I thought about the terrified woman I was supposed to be, the destitute IT worker crying in a cheap motel over a broken marriage. Instead, I was standing at the absolute pinnacle of my industry, holding total financial dominion over the people who had tried to destroy me. Jason was buried in a suburban basement paying off the cost of his own infidelity, while his ex-wife acquired commercial real estate. Amber was sitting in a failing office waiting for a certified letter that would reveal her worst nightmare had just become her permanent landlord. I did not need to scream or fight or lower myself to their level. I simply let their greed blind them to the trap, and then I bought the ground they walked on. I took a deep, steadying breath of the cool, air-conditioned air completely untouched by their chaos. I possessed total absolute control, and the view from the top was absolutely magnificent.